And joining us now on the debate, Gerard Seitz from the Ian O. Inatowicz Institute for Leadership at the Ivy School of Business. John Della Costa, founder of the Center for Ethical Orientation. Julia Gluck, certified management consultant and president of Adagio Enterprises, Inc. And Steve Maish, editor of Canadian Business Magazine. And it's good to have everybody around the table. You guys we've seen before, you two first-timers. Nice to have you around this table as well. I'm going to start with this Hippocratic Oath for Managers. I'm going to read this. Michael Smith, if you would, let's put this up. They did not actually say that greed is not good, but the oath taken on June 3rd, 2009 by more than 400 students graduating from Harvard Business School amounted to much the same thing. At an unofficial ceremony the day before they received their MBAs, the students promised that they would, among other things, quote, serve the greater good, act with the utmost integrity, and guard against decisions and behavior that advance my own narrow ambitions but harm the enterprise and the societies it served. That's from the Economist magazine from a couple of years ago. We're going to talk about whether or not the relatively newfound interest in offering ethics courses at MBA schools is useful. And I want to start with you, because you guys do it at Ivy, right? You've done it since 2004.
We have the Ivy Ring tradition, yes.
Why do it?
Well, at that time in 2004 when we started, it was something that we thought would be an honorable thing to do. It was championed by various stakeholders in the school as a subtle and maybe not so subtle reminder that the way we conduct ourselves at school and once we graduated is very important. And so to show a real commitment, we came up with that idea.
Julia, he says we came up with it, but at Harvard the students came up with it, right? It was a student that started it. Does that matter if it comes actually from the students themselves as opposed to from the administration or the school?
It would be nice to think that it came from the students all the time. I don't necessarily think that it's bad that it comes from the faculty. I'd prefer to see it from the students, but you know what? Any way we get it, I'm happy it's there.
Ethics at whatever way it comes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think of this, John?
I think that we need to look at society and society's ethics for business as opposed to business ethics in an systematic way.
Meaning what?
So, well, we had the academic institutions, we had students responding to a reality in society. They weren't making these claims or these promises without recognizing that there were real problems that had been building up in society, usually for 10, 15, even 20 years. And that's really where the root of the business ethics problem in business is. It's not necessarily just within the institution itself.
Fair enough. Okay, Steve, your view on this?
Well, I think ethics are a good thing and they're fine so far as they go, but the problem that I have is with the trend towards focusing on ethics as the key problem within the business community today. And I think that this is gaining momentum, and this fallacy that actually the crisis that we saw unfold in 2008 was primarily a manifestation of a lack of ethics within business. And I think that that's actually a dangerous diversion from the real underlying problem, which it tends to be more systemic, more complicated, and rooted in business culture and an inability to accurately assess risk.
You said primarily, so what percentage would you put what happened in 2008 on the lack of ethics in places like Wall Street?
It's a pure guess, but I think vanishingly small, like 1%. You're
1%?
Absolutely, because I think that what you're actually, if you tried to distill it down to people who knowingly acted unethically in a way to enrich themselves versus
at the expense of society.
Exactly, versus the much larger group who went along to get along, were focused on short-term gains, who convinced themselves that if the rating agencies say this is fine, then it should be good enough for me. That is the much, much larger group. And at its heart, it's not really an ethical failing so much as it is a failing to see the forest for the trees.
John.
And what I agree with is that the way that we've handled business ethics couldn't impact that situation. Mm-hmm. The problem is that ethical considerations have come so low on the totem pole. Alan Greenspan, when he was before Congress after the financial crisis, he said, I'm shocked that self-interest couldn't self-regulate. Mm-hmm. Well, the failure of self-regulation is in fact the failure of ethical imagination in day-to-day activity. So while it was perhaps a small percentage of people who made a conscious ethical decision to abuse the system, most people weren't thinking about ethics, and that's the problem. They weren't bringing it forward.
That's what I was going to say is the problem that I see with that argument is that people are not consciously thinking about doing the right thing more often. I think one should be thinking about that pretty much all the time, and if it is unconscious, then I think maybe there's a lack of ethics at the bottom, and that for me is a big issue.
Gerard?
I agree with everything that's been said here. I have a great sympathy for the argument that Steve is making here, because we actually, you know, with all the quotes and all the troubles that were going on, we actually started to interview approximately 300 people in London, England, New York, Hong Kong, and the major cities in Canada here. And we actually asked, so what really accounted for this crisis?
We meaning Ivy?
Ivy, yes, so myself and a number of colleagues. And clearly, loud and clear, it was an issue of character, of ethics. But there were also issues around competencies and also issues around kind of the commitment to the leadership role. This was a very complex problem. It would be too much of a stretch to say it was all around ethics and greed. Having said that though, Steve, the one thing that surprised us the most was the amount of time that people spent on character and ethical issues. This is a real problem.
They saw it as more than 1% of the problem from 2008.
Yes.
Okay.
I agree that is the popular perception, but I think that it's rooted far much. We've seen too many movies, if you will. We tend to look for villains. We don't tend to look at complex systemic problems because they quickly become boring, quite frankly. And this search for villains, I think, diverts us away from real changes, because people are responding to real incentives that are baked into the system. And to the extent that we bring out an oath and say, we're going to teach you about ethics and we're going to ask you to swear an oath, and we're going to expect that that is going to hold you back from responding to these very clear and present incentives that are in the system, I think is naive. John?
And there are two systemic issues that we've not talked about in light of this crisis. One is that most of the ethical meltdowns that we've had over the last 20 years have accompanied deregulation. Enron with electricity markets, WorldCom and Nortel in telecommunications, the financial sector, the pharmaceutical sector, which today is rife with ethical impropriety, are all sectors that had previously been heavily regulated and had a component of public good attached to them. And in deregulation, a new system wasn't created. The second structural element for me is that we've lost our sentinels. The accounting profession used to perform the role of the public guardian. Mm-hmm. With Enron, we saw how they got co-opted into the system of profit-making, lost their perspective. In the case now with mortgage derivatives in the financial crisis, it was the ratings agencies that were giving all sorts of accreditation to paper that was worthless. We've also seen it in a societal, and that's the reason I raised earlier, the societal dynamic. Many of our moral sentinels in society, the Catholic Church, our police forces, our political class, have also lost their moral authority for various reasons. So we're in a systemic reality today where we don't know how to have the conversation about the ethics.
What's the public administration? We can go on and on.
Mm-hmm. No, it's everywhere. Yeah. It is everywhere. But you said a few moments ago, Julia, and I wanted to pick up on this. You said, hard to know these days about doing the right thing. How would you define what the right thing is? Because I thought you're taught in MBA school that the right thing is to maximize shareholder profit. Period, full stop, move on. Isn't that it?
Well, it wasn't at the business school I taught in, I don't think, at least I hope not. Certainly when I was teaching MBA students, we talked about doing the right thing for the client, for the public, for our profession, and for ourselves. At the end of the day, I think if you have to live with yourself, that's the ultimate test. If you can't go to bed with yourself, you're really probably not going to do good work. Is good work the same as the right thing? I'm not sure, but it seems to me that MBA students need to have their feet on the ground in an ethical context, and if it means that that much profit isn't going to be made, but still some profit can be made, and that the shareholders and the stakeholders are going to remain in good standing, then that's enough for everybody.
Would you be content if that's how MBA students were taught across the continent?
No, and the reason is that I think it introduces an unrealistic amount of complexity into the calculus that is supposed to exist within the business mind. I'm all for ethics, I'm all for doing the right thing by society, but as soon as you start actually trying to define what the right thing is, I think you get into enormous difficulties. And I'd like to share an example if I can. McDonald's a few years ago introduced apples onto their menu as in response to a corporate social responsibility push, and a push that really the more ethical thing to do would be at least to offer a healthier option in the children's meals. And everybody agreed with this, and this was a good idea. They introduced apples. Well, now that we've been a few years into this decision, A couple of studies have come out that have pointed out that actually this has created massive problems with biodiversity in the apple market. When a huge buyer like McDonald's enters into the apple market, it distorts the market in important ways. For one thing, McDonald's sees the need that they always have to have the same kind of apple. They've all got to be roughly the same size. They've all got to be in a particular condition in order to make them saleable. And this has created distortions. And people say, well, that's McDonald's fault. They should accept many different kinds of apples. They should accept them with brown spots. And McDonald's stands back and says, the problem is people won't buy them. And if we invest all this money and go down this route only to have a product that people don't buy, increases waste, and we've defeated the purpose.
Better they shouldn't have offered apples in the first place?
No, what I'm saying is that it's extremely complicated. I don't know what they should have done. What I'm saying, but to look at it and say, you should do this, and then ignore the fact that it gets incredibly complicated once you get into the details of it, and to put that at the feet of the business leaders and say, you need to figure this out or you have done wrong, is a real problem.
Gerard, when you are teaching your MBA students at the Ivy School at UWO, do you have this checklist of 4 things that you want them to have close to their hearts as they're learning? You know, those 4, it's not just maximize shareholder profits, but it's also do good by the environment, do good by society, be able to look in the mirror at the end of the day.
Sure, the message cannot be create shareholder value. The message should be how do we create long-term value. And we can always focus, the shareholder will always be an important component to that. But we need to have, you know, great customer reputation is very important. Absolutely. How we deal with the employees in the organization. You know, at the Ivy School, you know, we care about developing business leaders who think globally, act strategically, and contribute to the societies in which they operate. Business have a conditional license to operate in society. Thinking about the environment and the communities must factor in the equation.
Let me ask John this then. If you knew that by hiring an Ivy grad, that meant that you were probably not going to realize a few percentage of maximizing profits because they're concerned about little things like the environment and society being healthy, who does that benefit?
I'm afraid that that's a false trade-off. Yes. Because I think what you're looking for, we've heard the word quality or character and integrity of individual. So if you find someone who has both the intelligence, the integrity, the commitment, they're going to be trying to creatively engage the complexity that you were talking about. They're going to be trying to work it through. And they're not going to be trying to do it alone. I would be wary of the freelancer who says, I'm going, you know, I will be the mini CEO and I'm going to solve everything and I'm going to drive bottom line performance. Because I'm not sure that is a sustainable model, and I'm not sure what happens to reputation and what happens to stakeholders. So I think just like we have often divorced strategy from ethics, got to do the strategic plan, then over here we'll do the ethics checklist to make sure the strategy doesn't violate things. It creates a false dichotomy. Really good strategic plans are asking social and ethical questions around long-term value, around sustainability. And the same thing, a good ethical question raises strategic opportunity. The Prius, you know, an electric car is a strategic opportunity out of an ethical, imaginative interpretation of an environmental problem.
Let me try this then. Can you, Julia, how about you on this? Can you teach people in their mid to late 20s who are also, in some respects, relatively, not fully formed individuals, but well on their way to being fully formed individuals, can you teach at that point in the game ethical conduct at school?
Well, I think that for me is the big question. People should be taught ethics right from their birth, and so if they're 22 or 23 or 24, can you teach it? I don't think we're talking about teaching ethics. I think we're talking about opening up the dialogue about ethics, about letting people know that there are other people who think the same way that they do, and that it's not just the leaders who have the responsibility, because that's one thing that I wanted to pick up, and it's not just the leaders of the organizations who have the responsibility to be ethical. It's the people on the ground facing the customer who also have to know that they need to be ethically responsible for what they do. And I don't think you can, in quotes, teach somebody that. To have the dialogue embedded in the conversations that are taking place at the business school, I think is absolutely critical.
Agreed. Steve, your question almost suggests that people stop learning or stop developing at age 20. I don't think that's the case. I think we have seen at the school, I think some of the empirical research bears it out, that people are capable of learning, that they are capable of, you know, doing a diagnosis, alter the behavior, and so forth. So I'm quite optimistic that, you know, after an event like 2008, 2009, the financial and economic crisis, you know, People will learn from this with some introspection, with some reflection, with the right experiences. Some of them will take lessons away, others might not.
Julie, you want to go back on that?
Well, I just wanted to build on that. One of the things that I experienced at the business school was the confluence of a whole bunch of things, not the least of which was different cultures coming into the classroom, different ages. So not all of the people in my class were 24 or 25. Some of them had a lot more business experience, and some of them were new Canadians. Some of them were going back to their home countries. And so the quality of the dialogue was very different from if we'd had only one culture being represented, only one business culture, only one country culture, and so on and so forth. So there was learning just from that point of view, and I think that was actually one of the best things about the program that I was involved in.
John.
To build on Julia's point, I have the opportunity, I teach an MBA class to mostly young people who are in the workforce, but I also teach in the Directors College to people who are mostly CEOs who sit on boards, teach ethics to both. Both are malleable. The degree of conversation that happens amongst young people is much richer. They're engaged, they're coming to it with a very different consciousness. As I've thought about why the older and more senior group is more resistant, what occurred to me is that they're all CEOs already. They only really have one vocabulary. Even though there's increasing diversity in that rank, there's actually a deficit in diversity in the sense that they all know how to talk the bottom line language. The ethical language is more foreign to them than it is to young people.
So they may need it more, ironically.
They need more help with tools, and we also need to see boards, the way boards themselves are constituted, change to reflect the kind of diversity that we're seeing in the B schools.
Steve, I know you're not nutty bananas about the oath, but what about the notion of teaching ethics in an MBA class? What do you think?
Fine, but we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's actually a solution.
So fine, but useless.
Not useless, but of limited use, put it to you that way, because a lot of these people that are let's say we reduce it down to what I believe is that 1% or less that actually were acting unethically. In the vast majority of cases, these aren't people that didn't know what the ethical path was. These weren't people that didn't know how to apply ethical principles to decision making. They broke the law in many cases. And I think in some way sitting back saying, well, we've really got to go back and teach the kids how to think ethically is a little bit naive. And again, diverts us away from something that Gerard was talking about, which is building into the system incentives that are focused on long-term health and fundamental questions like that social contract to operate that we really don't do a very good job of operating towards at all. We're very, very focused on the short term. And that's where you get into things that the broad public at large tends to interpret as a failure of ethics, which in my view are actually a failure to assess the long-term risks to the business.
Gerard, I want to give you the first opportunity to comment on this excerpt from the Globe and Mail that I'm going to read here, that Clifford Orwin, the University of Toronto professor, wrote about ethical lapses. And he says, now I'm a pretty good teacher, or so people say, yet give me Mr. Bernie Madoff, for one, 2 or 3 courses of ethics instructions, and he would still be Bernie Madoff. Would he have learned anything from the experience? Yes, he'd talk a much better game of ethics. Thanks to my teaching, he'd be an even greater menace to society. By the time a student arrives at university, and a fortiori, several years later when he ambles onto his MBA, his ethical character is already firmly set. Whether virtue can ever be taught was already a thorny question for Plato. Whether it can be taught to adults in a classroom shouldn't be a thorny question for anyone. To inform business students of what qualifies as ethical is one thing, to make them more ethical is quite another. Has he got a point? That's a long pause. That might mean that he does.
Steve, I can only talk about what I see in our classroom and what we do at the business school. I have seen, right, that if we offer people various experiences, right, experience embedded in the curriculum, experiences in the classroom, experience that students and faculty members bring to the classroom, we've seen personal transformations. Will that guarantee that people will be also ethical, once they're back in the workplace? Not necessarily. What we can do at the school is to offer ideas, thoughts, tools, guidelines, discussions, skills. One of the things that I think where business schools in the past might have gotten it wrong is that there's too much emphasis on theory and analysis and not nearly enough emphasis on actually the skills and the confidence to stand up and say, listen, this ain't right. How do we get people the skills and the confidence to articulate, right, what to say, how to say, to whom to say?
Okay, but Julia, I don't mean to be facetious about this, but can you think of a single example of somebody, maybe a former student of yours, who was going to act unethically in the business world, but then thought, oh wait, I took ethics from Julia Gluck, I better not do that after all?
Well, actually, I hope that there are some people who have acted because of what we talked about in my classroom. And I can think of a couple of people, actually, who are in situations where things are not going necessarily the way we'd like. I'm not sure that people are doing the right thing. And he keeps coming back to me to say, you know, I learned some things from you, and I'm prepared to do something different now as a result of that. So yeah, I think people can be transformed, and they have to see role models who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, as opposed to just being people who believe in what they stand for.
You know, one of the things we actually, as a direct result of kind of the leadership and trial, the work that I referred to earlier, one of the things that we did have a new course on leadership. And we bring all these executives to the classroom, and they serve as mentors. They have in the past either made colossal mistakes, are ready to talk about it, or they've done something extraordinary and talk about it as well.
Give me an example of that. Who's somebody who really screwed up and now you've brought them into class?
Well, for example, this was fairly controversial. We don't have an ongoing contact, but Nick Leeson, Barings Bank, a few years ago, brought him to Ivy, very controversial. Why would you pay a criminal? But I thought that all around it was an excellent day, because Nick Leeson did not wake up one day and said, you know what, I think I'm gonna bring Barings Bank under. It didn't happen that way. So he went through his personal story, and you have students sitting there saying, you know what, I could have been that guy. And so it is just a seed that we plant.
How much you pay him?
Not relevant.
But interesting. Okay, John.
There are many critics who say that the problem with the current structure of business ethics is that we put institutional or corporate pressures on a single individual. So the entire organization is out to make a short-term profit for this quarter, and it's up to you as the gatekeeper on this particular project to make sure that all these norms from an ethics perspective or social responsibility perspective are met. So that's an unfair expectation. That's why I think that the comments that you were reading earlier do raise for us whether from a business ethics perspective we are doing enough to change the culture. Not only empower the individual or enable the individual through skills to ask different questions, but to actually create the culture around them. So the colleagues, the peers, the mentors who will raise other possibilities, who will bring other experiences to push out that horizon to the longer term.
Let me broaden that out, Julia, with you for a second here. How do you deal in your classes with situations like this? There are countries, and we don't have to make a list, we all know what they are, where to do business, if you're a Canadian business person and you're trying to do business in one of these other countries, you have to actually factor into your budget.
Bakshish.
Yeah, bakshish, good way to put it. Yeah, grease, you got to grease some palms along the way. How do you deal with that kind of thing?
Well, what I've said to my students is, ultimately, again, it's a question of what you want to do, what the corporation, your organization is asking you to do. And if you don't agree with the way business is run in a particular place, you can say, I don't want to do business there.
Oh, so easier said than done, right? Who's going to torpedo their career? You would, eh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you done that?
Yes, actually, I've said no a number of times.
Want to give an example?
Sure. I was being asked to teach a particular topic in a place where I believed it was project management. And I believed that the way we taught, I was working for another organization at the time, not myself, the way we taught project management was much broader than what most people thought about project management. And I believed that the organization with which I was being asked to work would take that and not use it, based on interviews and so on and contact that I had with the organization, that they would not do things the way we were recommending.
So you turn the business down?
And I turned the business down. And people say to me, well, how can you do that? And I say, because I couldn't go to sleep at night if I did that.
But
it's as simple as that. Yeah, and you know what? There are people who will do things the way I believe they should be done, and I can work with people who can learn to look at things at a little bit of a different way, and I can do the same thing. And I think you have to do that. But you can't do that, Steve, without dialogue.
John, what advice would you give to a young MBA student right now who's thinking to him or herself, I want to move up the food chain in the company in which I'm working. It may require, if I'm doing business in some of these countries, to cut some corners that I personally don't like cutting, but those are the standards in the country in which I'm trying to get some business.
Julia raised a couple of issues in some of her earlier comments around recognizing the diversity that's in play in today's global reality. This issue of corruption or of bribery is affecting a lot of the markets that we operate within, and there's also a fair degree of sort of soft corruption even in our own economy, if we look at the way subsidies can distort market dynamics, for example. So the whole thing around having conversations with these people, recognizing that there is work, like theologians have been working on global ethics thinking. Management scholars have been trying to use that understanding so that there can be a constructive conversation about what's fair, what's respectful, what is sustainable for the long term. And that's a very, very exciting area to be exploring. And I know that there are all sorts of business pressures from operating globally. There are environmental pressures, but these are not challenges that can be ignored. They have to be engaged, and what we're finally getting are some of the skills for engaging them.
What would you say to that youngster? You not only cover business, but you work for a big business yourself.
Yeah,
so
I would say that, I mean, at the very least, you've got to follow the law, and ultimately, you've got to let your own conscience be your guide. I know that following the law is not nearly enough for certain people, but my one fear in this dialogue as corporate business ethics has become more and more trendy and more of the focus is that everybody keeps on saying business should be about more than profit, and we can all agree about that. But I'm worried that the pursuit of profit and the pursuit of prosperity is getting pushed further and further down, to the extent that actually in some circles the very pursuit of profit is in itself being discredited. And I think that is a real problem the further we push down that road. And you know, one of the things, for example, is corporate donations to charity. A lot of people would stand back and say, well, this is absolutely a good. Corporations should be encouraged to give to charity. Well, in the case of public corporations, I think there's a very strong ethical case to be made that if you think you've got enough money to give to charity, increase the dividend and encourage your shareholders to give to charity. Because it's not your money to make those calls with. And you can make a very strong ethical case on that. But this is where things get complicated. And I don't think that there is a simple right answer, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that at the end of the day, profit is in itself a good and not something that we should be punishing.
So, Mr. Gecko, greed is good?
Greed is an important element in growth.
Punkt. Go ahead.
I want to follow up on an issue that Steve raised, conscience. At the school we are developing leaders, we hope. And so a few miles down the road here's the CN Tower. I learned an interesting fact the other day that it should be able to withstand 260-mile storm. It's able to do that because it has a very strong foundation. It is anchored into something. And I think sometimes with our students, HBAs, MBAs, it's not always that they understand their inner selves and their core values, what they really stand for, what are their beliefs anchored in. And my belief is that if people understand who they are, kind of the self-knowledge, but all the blind spot, I think they're in a much better position to say no, yes, maybe.
How open do you think the faculty in places like yours are to opening up that concept of greed is good and that there is a greater good beyond maximizing profits?
Oh, I think we talk about these things all the time.
Yeah.
Just as the students are very diverse in opinions, so you have the faculty, which makes teaching at the Ivy School so interesting, because here's the important thing. You might say, well, I invite a leadership guy to talk about ethics. Just not me, Steve. Everybody owns this in the business.
Even the guys in finance?
Of course they do, and the marketing people do, the accounting people do, the strategy people do. You can't outsource this. There are no strategy problems or finance problems, there's a business problem. And all of us in a business school own this. It starts with admissions, it's the dean, it's the program directors, the individual faculty, the students, and so forth.
Can I just on greed? The thing is,
and then because I was going to get back to you on that. I know you wanted back in on that.
I sensed I was about to get hammered on
my objection.
I think greed is actually the pursuit of profit in disregard of everything else. You know what I mean? I don't think pursuing profit and pursuing growth and prosperity is the same thing as greed.
And that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
And I think that where business ethics have failed, you're absolutely right in the past, is they attacked all profitability. Mm-hmm. But what has happened is that especially since greed is good has become an ethos, which is really since the 1980s, mm-hmm. what we've actually seen is that ethical and corporate social responsibility thinking has declined. Mm-hmm. So both of the attentions that are being given to those spheres are to try to combat the thinking that greed is good. Because what's happened with greed is good is what we saw with the derivatives and the banking collapse. That was, to me, the ultimate manifestation of greed is good. Just as you wouldn't encourage your kids at the dinner table to go for greed, why would you practice that in a commercial interaction where, again, we're thinking about how do we achieve long-term sustainability? So profitability and disciplined orientation towards success, wonderful. But within all the moderations that also require reputation, integrity, concern for the community. And these were, in a sense, factors that governments used to impose on companies that have been diluted because of globalization. So what's happened is it's been civil society's turn to try to raise the orientation on that, because greed is good has taken off in such a negative way.
But I'm sensing here that you didn't mean greed is good in the sense of the 7 deadly sin greed. You meant in the pursuit of growth, in the pursuit of...
But that's not the way people hear it.
Yeah.
And the problem I have is that since the 80s, God bless Oliver Stone, those two things have been conflated in a way that I think is dishonest and in the long term damaging. You say that corporate social responsibility thinking has eroded. I think we're actually more focused on questions of corporate social responsibility today than we have been at any point in our history.
The UN just published a report that showed that after a decade of UN Global Compact compliance by the Fortune 1000, the largest corporations in the world, that the actual impact of those corporate social responsibilities projects is less than the impact on the bottom line of those companies. They were more profitable for being socially responsible than there was benefit to the community. So people are using it strategically, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's overdone.
Okay, we got about a minute and a half left, and let me put this on the table then, just to finish off here. I think it's fair to say that among a huge swath of Main Street, what happened in 2008, the financial sector meltdown, made a lot of people question many aspects of capitalism, in particular how ethical all the people on Wall Street acted. And it won't stop at Wall Street. We can go beyond that. We can go to Congress, we can go to halls of academia, and so on and so forth. To you first, Gerard. Teaching ethics in business schools, do you really think you can turn the corner on how people, on how Main Street sees Wall Street because of this?
I'm an optimist, absolutely. You know, I would say, you know, cynics might say that will never happen. Skeptics say it's unlikely. I believe that there is no alternative. If we really think about prosperity and well-being, collectively we have to start doing things different in business schools, in organizations, to just move people in the right direction.
Julia?
Start the dialogue.
Start the dialogue?
Yep.
And what happens?
And at least we're talking about it out loud. And if we model the behavior, I think that people will begin to turn those corners.
And Steve, you may change a few minds along the way?
It's great to change minds, but this is not unprecedented. Capitalism came into disrepute in the 30s and 40s as well, and what changed it ultimately, as much as I'm all for dialogue about ethics, it wasn't that changed attitudes, it was growth, it was a return to prosperity.
John, last hand to you.
It was actually regulation that allowed growth to occur, and I would say that part of the challenge is ending the dichotomy between ethics and strategy.
And as always on this program, it is the clock that is our enemy, not ethics, and the clock says we're done. Can I thank everybody for being on the program today? Julia Glock, the Certified Management Consultant, President of Adagio Enterprises. Gerard Seitz from the Ivy School of Business. Good of both of you to be here today. And on the other side of the table, John Delacosta at the Center for Ethical Orientation. Steve Maish, editor of Canadian Business Magazine. Thanks so much, everybody.